stick to selling scrap, Caleb. Vanessa's voice cut across the yard like a blade, loud enough for every worker to hear. She pulled the ring off her finger and dropped it onto the oil-stained concrete. No hesitation, no ceremony, then turned and walked away through the laughter of men who had never respected him either. Caleb Hayes stood exactly where she left him, grease on his hands, dust on his boots, saying nothing. Then a black Rolls-Royce pulled up to the front gate, and a woman in a charcoal suit stepped out. She walked straight toward Caleb and extended her hand. The yard smelled the way it always did, burnt metal machine oil and something faintly chemical that never fully left the air, no matter how strong the coastal wind blew in off the water. Caleb Hayes had stopped noticing the smell years ago. It was the sound he still paid attention to, the low groan of compacted steel, the rhythmic clang of sorted aluminum hitting the bin, the occasional hiss of a pressure line releasing. Those sounds told him more about the state of the yard than any inventory sheet ever could. He ran the place the way a man runs something he built with his own hands and refuses to let die, not with pride exactly, but with a kind of stubborn, quiet devotion that looked like stubbornness from the outside and felt like survival from the inside. Hayes' salvage sat on the edge of a town that had been industrial once and was now mostly trying to forget it. The refinery 2 miles north had closed in the early 2000s. The shipping depot that used to employ half the county had relocated. What was left were strip malls, a diner that served breakfast all day, and a coastline that was pretty enough in the summer to bring in tourists who never stayed long. Caleb's yard was not the kind of place tourists photographed. It occupied a wide, flat lot, bordered by a chain-link fence and a row of dying pines, filled with rows of sorted metal-stripped machinery and salvaged components laid out in an order that looked chaotic to anyone who didn't know the system and made perfect sense to anyone who did. Caleb had built that system himself over nearly a decade, not from a business school playbook or a consultant's recommendation, but from watching what got wasted and deciding it didn't have to be. He had developed a method for disassembling industrial equipment down to its smallest reusable components: bearings, coils, capacitor, banks, copper windings, and routing each piece to where it could be used again rather than melted down or buried. The efficiency wasn't something he advertised. It wasn't something he talked about at all. It was just the way he worked, the only way he knew how to work, built out of years of learning what things were actually worth beneath the surface rust. The business, however, was failing. It had been failing slowly for years, the kind of failure that doesn't announce itself all at once, but shows up instead in the form of a past due notice. Here, a deferred repair. There, a contract that doesn't renew and isn't replaced. Caleb knew the numbers well enough to know they were bad. He also knew he hadn't figured out how to fix them, and some mornings, he wasn't entirely sure he believed they could be fixed. He kept working anyway. It was the only response he had ever found to a problem he couldn't immediately solve. Vanessa Cole had been in his life for 2 years, and for most of those 2 years, she had made it clear in ways large and small that she expected the situation to change. She was sharp attractive in a way that made people pay attention when she entered a room, and entirely honest about what she wanted from life, which was more than this town, more than this yard, more than a man who came home every evening with grease under his fingernails and no clear plan for what came next. She hadn't hidden those expectations. Caleb had told himself he respected her for that. He had also told himself for longer than he should have that he was going to be enough for her eventually, that the yard would turn a corner, that she would see what he saw in it. She didn't. The argument that afternoon started the way their arguments usually started, with something small that wasn't really about something small. Vanessa had come to the yard to tell him she'd turned down a job offer in the city because she felt like she couldn't leave while things between them were still unresolved. She said it the way people say things they've rehearsed but are still angry about. Caleb was in the middle of pulling the motor housing off a salvaged industrial compressor, and he didn't set the work down when she started talking, which was the wrong choice. and he knew it was the wrong choice, approximately 2 seconds after he made it. What followed was not an argument, so much as an arrival, the moment when everything that had been building for months finally reached the surface and stopped pretending to be about anything other than what it was. Vanessa said she was tired of waiting for him to become something different. She said she had believed in him once, and that belief had cost her. She said the yard was a dead end, and that staying with him meant accepting a dead end as her future, and she was not willing to do that. Every word landed in the open air of the yard, and the 2 workers on the far end of the lot had gone very still in the way that people go still when they're trying not to be caught listening. Caleb set down the tool he was holding. He looked at her and didn't say anything for a moment, not because he had nothing to say, but because the things he wanted to say would not have helped the situation. And he knew that much about himself. Vanessa pulled the ring off her finger and set it down on the concrete near his feet. Not through it, set it deliberately like a period at the end of a sentence she had already decided to finish. Then she turned and walked toward the gate, and one of the workers made a sound that was half laugh and quickly swallowed, and another one looked away in that specific way that meant he'd heard everything and would be talking about it later. Caleb didn't call after her. He stood there with the ring on the concrete between them and the sound of her footsteps receding across the gravel, and he didn't move. Not because he was calm, because he had learned a long time ago that the version of himself that chased after people who had already decided to leave never got back anything worth keeping. He picked up the ring and set it on the workbench inside the main shed. Then he went back to the compressor. He was still working on it 40 minutes later when he heard tires on the gravel, a different sound than the trucks he was used to, too smooth too even, and he looked up to see a black Rolls-Royce pull through the open gate and stop just inside the fence line. The driver stayed in the car. The woman who stepped out of the rear door was somewhere in her mid-40s, wearing a charcoal suit that had not been bought in any store within 200 miles of this town. She looked around the yard without any of the usual expressions people wore when they saw the yard. For the first time, no distaste, no confusion, no performative curiosity. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they came specifically to see. She walked directly toward Caleb. "Caleb Hayes," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's right," Caleb said. "Evelyn Carter." She extended her hand, and he shook it, aware that his hand was dirty, and that she either didn't mind or had decided not to mind, which amounted to the same thing. "I run Carter Dynamics. We build energy recovery infrastructure. Large-scale, mostly industrial." Caleb had heard of Carter Dynamics in the way that people in his industry heard about things at a distance, through trade publications, through references and conversations about government contracts, through the kind of news that didn't feel relevant to a yard the size of his. He hadn't heard of Evelyn Carter specifically, but he could see from the way she stood and the way she spoke that she was not someone who showed up places without a reason. "What brings you out here?" he asked. Evelyn looked past him toward the rows of sorted components laid out across the yard. Her eyes moved with the specific attention of someone who understood what they were looking at. "I've been watching some of the salvage operations in this region for about 8 months, she said. "Trying to understand why most of them lose 30 to 40% of recoverable material in processing." She looked back at him. "Your operation loses less than 4%. Caleb didn't say anything. "That's not an accident," Evelyn said. "And it's not equipment. Your equipment is older than most of what your competitors are running. So it's method. Your disassembly and component routing system, I've had 3 engineers look at what they could observe from the outside, and none of them can fully reconstruct how you built it. That's unusual." She looked at him steadily. "I'd like to understand it better, and I'd like to talk about what it could become at a different scale." There was a version of Caleb that would have responded to that with something like enthusiasm. That version was younger and had not yet spent years being told in ways direct and indirect that what he built here was a dead end. He looked at this woman in her charcoal suit with her composed expression, and her engineers who couldn't figure out his system, and he felt something he hadn't expected to feel, which was tired. "I appreciate you coming out," he said. "But I'm not really looking for outside involvement right now." Evelyn didn't push back immediately. She looked at the compressor he'd been working on then, at the organized grid of components, on the rack behind him. Copper windings sorted by gauge motor housings, in descending order by frame-size circuit boards, with handwritten tags indicating their tested functionality. She looked at all of it, the way you look at something you recognize. "These boards," she said, indicating the tagged components. "You're testing them before routing." "Everyone," Caleb said. "Most yards melt the whole assembly." "Most yards don't know what's still working inside it," Caleb said. Evelyn nodded, not in the way people nod when they're being polite, but in the way people nod when something confirms what they already thought. "I'll leave you my card," she said. She took a card from her jacket pocket and set it on the workbench near the motor housing he'd been disassembling. "If you change your mind," she walked back to the car. The driver pulled out of the yard with the same smooth quietness the car had arrived with, and Caleb stood in the middle of his failing salvage operation and looked at the business card sitting next to a ring he hadn't decided what to do with yet. He went back to work, but Evelyn Carter came back, not with the car, not with the suit. She came back 3 days later in a plain dark jacket. No driver parked a regular sedan outside the fence, and walked in like someone who had decided to take a different approach. She didn't interrupt what Caleb was doing. She found a spot near the sorting area where she wasn't in the way, and she watched. She stayed for 2 hours, didn't ask questions, and left without saying much, beyond a brief acknowledgement. When Caleb looked up, he didn't ask her to leave. He wasn't entirely sure why. She came back again 2 days after that, and again the following week. She watched the way he moved through the yard, efficient, unhurried, with the particular economy of motion that comes from years of performing the same tasks in the same space. She watched him make decisions about materials that most people in the industry would have processed in bulk, stopping to test individual components with a handheld meter sorting pieces that most yards would have written off as scrap into a separate rack he called the second chance pile. She watched him negotiate with a parts dealer over the phone, quoting specifications from memory, with an accuracy that suggested he carried an internal catalog of every piece in the yard. She watched all of it and said very little. On her 4th visit, she sat on the tailgate of a flatbed that wasn't going anywhere and said, "You know, the interesting part isn't the efficiency rating. The interesting part is the philosophy behind it." Caleb was sorting copper wire by gauge and didn't look up. "I'm not sure I'd call it a philosophy." "What would you call it?" He considered the question for a moment, turning a length of wire in his hands. "Paying attention," he finally said. "Most people look at broken equipment and see what it can't do anymore. I look at it and see what it still can." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the part I want to scale." Caleb set the wire down and looked at her directly. "Ms. Carter, I've got a yard that's 3 months from not making payroll. I've got equipment held together with repairs I did myself, and a system that works because I personally built every part of it, and I'm the one running it every day. What you're describing, scaling it, turning it into something larger, I don't know how to do that without destroying what makes it work. And I'm not sure anybody does." Evelyn didn't flinch at the honesty. "That's a real concern," she said. "I'm not dismissing it." "But you still want to try," Caleb said. "I still want to talk about it," she said. "There's a difference." Caleb looked at the yard around him, the rows he'd built, the system he'd designed, the work that continued every day, whether anyone was watching or not. He thought about Vanessa walking away through the laughter of men who had already made up their minds about him. He thought about the business card still sitting on the workbench, and the ring sitting next to it, and the way both of them had been sitting there for over a week without him doing anything about either. He was not ready to say yes to whatever Evelyn Carter was proposing. He didn't fully trust the proposal yet, and he didn't fully trust himself to separate the proposal from the strange fact that someone with her resources had come back to this yard 4 times to sit quietly and watch him work. He had never had that before, not the attention of someone who wasn't waiting for him to become something different, but was instead paying careful attention to what he already was. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no again either. "Come back Thursday," he said. "I'll show you the full routing system, how it actually works, not just what it looks like from the outside." Evelyn stood up from the tailgate and straightened her jacket. There was nothing triumphant in her expression, no indication that she thought she'd won something. She just nodded. "Thursday," she said, and walked back toward the gate. Caleb watched the sedan pull away. Then he looked back at the yard, at the components on the rack he called the second chance pile, at the tagged boards, at the sorted rows that represented years of decisions made in the absence of any real outside recognition, and he felt something shift in him. Not hope, exactly. Something quieter than hope, and more durable. The faint, reluctant recognition that maybe not everything he had built here was only visible to him. He picked up the copper wire and went back to work. Thursday came, and Caleb showed her everything. He walked Evelyn through the full routing system from the intake point at the front gate to the final sorting racks at the back of the yard, explaining each decision node, in the process, where a piece of equipment got assessed, how that assessment determined the disassembly sequence, which components went to which destination, based on their tested condition, rather than their apparent age or surface damage. He explained it the way a man explained something he has never had to put into words before finding the language as he went, sometimes stopping mid-sentence to demonstrate rather than describe. Evelyn kept up without difficulty. She asked precise questions at precise moments, the kind of questions that told him she was tracking the logic rather than just collecting information. By the end of the walkthrough, she was quiet for a long stretch, looking out over the organized grid of the yard, with an expression he couldn't immediately read. Then she said, "You built this system around a core assumption that most industrial salvage operations don't make." "What assumption is that?" Caleb asked. "That the default answer is recovery," Evelyn said. "Every other system I've studied defaults to extraction. You take what's easy to get and process the rest in bulk. Your system defaults to recovery. Every component gets a chance to prove it's still useful before it gets treated as raw material. That's the inversion, and that's what makes the efficiency numbers what they are." Caleb hadn't thought about it in exactly those terms before, but he recognized the description as accurate. "It takes longer," he said. "That's why nobody else does it." "It takes longer per unit," Evelyn said. "But your yield per ton of intake is more than double the regional average. Over volume, it's not slower. It's faster in every way that actually matters economically." She looked at him directly. "That's what I want to build on. Not your equipment, not your location, your logic." That was the conversation that moved them from talking to actually building something. Over the following 6 weeks, they established a trial partnership, limited in scope, structured carefully with Caleb retaining full operational control of the yard, and Evelyn providing capital to stabilize the payroll situation and fund a modest expansion of the sorting infrastructure. There were lawyers involved, and documents, and several conversations that Caleb found deeply uncomfortable because they required him to assign numerical values to things he had only ever thought about in practical terms. Evelyn navigated those conversations with a patience he hadn't expected from someone of her position, and she never once treated his discomfort as a negotiating weakness. The friction came from other directions. Evelyn's board of directors had approved the trial partnership without enthusiasm. 3 of the 5 members had voted for it, only because Evelyn had a track record that made opposing her a calculated risk, and they made their reservations known through the kind of passive institutional pressure that expressed itself in delayed approvals, additional documentation requirements, and a steady stream of consultants sent to evaluate the yard with the specific brief of finding reasons to reconsider. Caleb could tell what the consultants were doing the moment they arrived. They came in expensive vehicles with expensive shoes and walked around the yard with the studied neutrality of people who had already formed opinions they were being paid to present as findings. One of them, a man named Bradford, who worked for a firm out of Boston, spent 2 days at the yard and then produced a report that described the operation as artisanal in scale and idiosyncratic in method, presenting significant challenges for systematization and replication. Caleb read the report twice. He agreed with parts of it. The parts he agreed with were the parts that worried him most about what he had agreed to. He brought the report to Evelyn at the end of the week. She was at the yard more often now, not as an observer, but as an active partner working out of a temporary office she'd set up in the old foreman's room off the main shed. She read the relevant sections without visible reaction, then set the report down on the desk. Bradford's analysis isn't wrong, she said. He's just answering the wrong question. He's asking whether your system can be replicated exactly. It can't. That's not the point. What is the point? Caleb asked. The point is whether the principle behind it can be taught, Evelyn said. Not the specific layout of your yard, not your particular routing decisions. The default assumption recovery over extraction. That's what you teach. The rest of it adapts to each location. She looked at him steadily. You know the difference between your method and your methodology, don't you? Caleb thought about that for a moment. One of those I can hand off, he said. Exactly, Evelyn said. He didn't fully resolve the tension that conversation named, but it gave him a frame for the problem that felt workable rather than impossible. That was, he was beginning to understand something Evelyn was good at, not eliminating the difficulty of a thing, but making its shape clear enough that you could figure out how to move through it. The other friction was harder to navigate because it lived closer to the surface of daily life rather than in boardroom documents. Caleb had never liked what formal business environments required of him. He had sat through 3 meetings at Carter Dynamics' regional office and found all 3 of them excruciating in a way he couldn't entirely articulate to Evelyn, not because the people were hostile, but because the entire mode of communication assumed a fluency he didn't have and wasn't sure he wanted to develop. He came home from those meetings, feeling a version of himself he didn't recognize and wasn't sure he trusted. After the 3rd meeting, he told Evelyn he wasn't going to do them anymore. At least not in that format, not in that building, not in that room with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the agenda printed on branded stationery. He said it expecting an argument. Evelyn thought about it for a moment and then said, "Fine, we do them here instead." And after that, they did standing meetings at the yard walking the rows while they talked, which suited Caleb considerably better and turned out, somewhat to his surprise, to produce better decisions. Around this same period, Evelyn mentioned almost in passing that she was scouting a second site, an industrial corridor about 40 miles up the coast that had the same bones as Caleb's town, the same shuttered facilities and depleted supply chain. There was an existing salvage operation there, she said, smaller and running without any real system. She wasn't pushing him toward it yet. She was just letting him know it existed, the way you point something out to someone before you need them to look at it. Caleb noted the mention and said nothing, but he didn't forget it either. It was somewhere in the middle of all this, the trial partnership, the consultant reports, the board, friction, the slow and imperfect process of 2 very different people trying to build something together, that the video appeared. One of the newer workers at the yard, a young man named Travis, had filmed about 12 minutes of Caleb working on a particularly complex disassembly job, a decommissioned industrial turbine, from a facility that was being demolished 2 counties over. The turbine was large, expensive when new, and had been declared non-recoverable by 2 separate contractors before the demolition company agreed to let Caleb take it for the cost of transport. He had spent 3 days on it methodically, identifying which subassemblies were still within tolerance, which bearings could be cleaned and reused, which copper windings were worth pulling versus which had sustained too much thermal damage. By the end, he had recovered nearly 60% of the unit's components as directly reusable parts, which the 2 previous contractors had collectively determined to be 0%. Travis had posted the video without mentioning it to anyone, just a raw clip on one of the short-form video platforms, with a caption that said something like, "Guy at work figured out how to unjunk an unjunkable turbine." It had gotten a few hundred views in the first day, then a few thousand. Then something that happened online when a piece of content crossed an invisible threshold, accelerating, spreading, being reposted by accounts with large audiences in the engineering and sustainability communities, attached to commentary that was alternately technical and emotional, dissected by people who understood what they were looking at, and shared by people who didn't, but felt something watching it anyway. By the end of the week, the video had been seen by several million people. The phrase that kept appearing in the commentary was "zero waste scrap system," which was not a phrase Caleb had ever used to describe what he did, but which turned out to be accurate in a way he couldn't argue with. He didn't know how to process any of it. He watched the view counter climb on Travis's phone during a break and felt something in his chest that was not quite pride and not quite dread, but contained elements of both. The inquiry started before the week was out. Emails to an address Travis had included in the video description that went to a general inbox nobody had been monitoring. Then phone calls to the yard's main line, then 2 in-person visits from representatives of companies Caleb had never heard of, and one from a company he had, a large industrial materials corporation based in the Midwest, with revenues in the billions. They were all polite, all interested, and all carrying variations of the same offer. They wanted to buy what Caleb had built. The Midwest corporation's offer was the serious one. Their representative, a precise man named Gordon, who wore a tie even to the yard, presented a figure that Caleb had to hear twice before he was sure he'd heard it correctly. The offer was for full acquisition, intellectual property, operational documentation, brand rights, everything. In exchange, the yard itself would be closed and redeveloped. The workers with tenure would receive severance packages that Gordon described as generous, and that Caleb would later verify were adequate, but not generous. The system would be absorbed into the corporation's existing infrastructure and operated at scale under their methods, which Gordon described as aligned with your principles, in a way that Caleb understood to mean they would be systematically modified until they weren't recognizable. Caleb sat across from Gordon in the foreman's office for over an hour and listened to everything carefully. The number Gordon had put on the table was real. It would solve every financial problem Caleb currently had and create a set of entirely different problems that were at least more comfortable to have. Part of him, the part that had been running on not quite enough for so many years that the feeling had become structural, heard that number and wanted to stop fighting. He told Gordon he would think about it. He was still thinking about it 3 days later when Vanessa came back. She showed up at the yard on a Tuesday afternoon, looking the way she always looked, composed, carefully put together, bringing with her the particular quality of attention that had drawn him to her in the first place. She stood at the gate and waited for him to come to her, rather than walking in, which told him something. He went to the gate, and they stood on either side of it for a moment before he opened it and let her in. "I saw the video," she said. It was not an apology, but it was the closest thing to an opening she was offering. "Lot of people did," Caleb said. Vanessa looked around the yard with an expression he recognized, recalibrating, reassessing, measuring the distance between what she had dismissed and what it had turned out to be. "I was angry when I left," she said. "I said things I shouldn't have said the way I said them. You deserved better than that." Caleb looked at her and didn't say anything, waiting to see where she intended to take this. "I don't think I was wrong about everything," she continued with the honesty that had always been one of her genuine qualities. "But I think I was wrong about this place, about what you were actually building here." She met his eyes. "I'd like to talk about whether there's still something between us worth talking about." Caleb felt the pull of it, not the old pull of wanting to be chosen by her, but something more complicated and less easy to dismiss. She was being honest. She was making an effort. Those things were real. He also knew that what had driven her away in the first place hadn't been anger. It had been a calculation about his worth, and the calculation had changed because the numbers had changed. He knew that. He wasn't entirely sure it mattered. He wasn't entirely sure it didn't. He said, "I'll hear you out." They talked for an hour in the foreman's office, Vanessa in the chair on the other side of the desk, where Gordon had sat 3 days earlier, which Caleb noticed and found grimly apt. She said things he believed and things he wasn't sure about, and a few things he actively doubted, and he listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he said he needed time to think, and she accepted that without pushing, which was also different from how she used to handle uncertainty. When Vanessa left, she walked out through the main gate and stood near her car for a moment, phone in hand. Caleb was still in the doorway of the foreman's office, and the distance between them was short enough that her voice carried clearly when she said to whoever she'd called, "I don't know. Maybe. If he'd had money from the start, I never would have left." She said it without cruelty, just plainly the way people speak when they think no one is listening. Then she got in the car and drove away. Caleb stood in the doorway and didn't move for a long moment. Then he went back inside. He sat alone in the office for a long time after that. He was thinking about the acquisition offer and the conversation with Vanessa, and the fact that both had arrived in the same week, and he was also thinking about something Evelyn had said to him early in their work together, not a dramatic statement, just an offhand observation she'd made while they were walking the yard one afternoon. She had been looking at the rack where he kept components that most yards would have melted down, the pieces he tested individually before deciding they were worth recovering. She had said, "The thing that strikes me about your system is that you never assume something is done being useful just because someone else decided it was." She hadn't been talking about anything other than metal, but he had thought about it several times since. He thought about it again now. The question was not whether the acquisition offer was real money. It was real money. The question was not whether Vanessa had changed. She might have. The question was what he was going to do with the version of himself that had built this place, this system, this way of looking at things, and whether selling it or folding it back into something older and easier was the same as deciding it had stopped being useful before he'd found out what it could actually become. He didn't have an answer yet, but he was starting to understand what the question actually was. He stopped answering his phone for 4 days. Not dramatically, not as a statement, he just stopped. He let the calls from Gordon go to voicemail, let the emails from Carter Dynamics' legal team sit unread, let Vanessa's 2 follow-up messages remain unanswered. He came to the yard every morning, the way he always had earlier than anyone else, and he worked. Not on the expansion planning documents, or the acquisition response, or any of the things that had accumulated on the desk in the foreman's office. He worked on the yard itself, pulling apart a set of decommissioned hydraulic actuators that had been sitting in the back corner for 3 months, testing each one, sorting them into the recovery rack or the melt pile based on what he found. It was the most straightforward thing he knew how to do, and he needed straightforward. The workers noticed the shift, but didn't comment on it directly. Travis, who had started the whole viral sequence without understanding what he was starting, had the particular guilt of someone who had handed someone else a grenade without knowing what it was. He worked harder than usual and asked fewer questions than usual, which Caleb appreciated without saying so. On the 3rd day working alone after the others had left, Caleb found himself standing in the middle of the yard in the late afternoon with a hydraulic rod in his hand, and no clear memory of what he'd decided to do with it. He stood there for a full minute, looking at the rows he'd built over nearly a decade. The organization, the system, the accumulated logic of thousands of small decisions made in the direction of not wasting what still had use. He thought about Gordon's offer. He thought about what the yard would become under a corporation that would take the method and route it through their existing infrastructure until the default assumption shifted back from recovery to extraction, quietly and incrementally, the way those shifts always happened. He thought about the workers and what adequate but not generous severance actually meant in practical terms for men who had been here for years. He thought about all of it and understood, with a clarity that surprised him, by arriving without drama, that he was not going to take the offer. He had known it for several days. He had just needed the space to confirm it. What he hadn't resolved was everything else. Evelyn found him on the 4th day. She came to the yard in the late morning, no meeting scheduled, no advance notice, just the sedan pulling through the gate the way it had been doing for months. Now, familiar enough that the workers didn't look up. She found him in the main shed reassembling a motor housing, and she sat down on the stool near the workbench, without preamble, and without the specific energy of someone who had come to deliver a position. She didn't ask about the acquisition offer. She didn't ask about the legal team's emails, or the pending decisions, or any of the things that were technically urgent. She sat there for a while and watched him work the way she had in the beginning, before any of this had become complicated. Then she said, "If you close this place, sell it. Walk away. Whatever form it takes." "What do you do the next morning?" Caleb kept working. "Get up. Find something else." "That's not what I mean," Evelyn said. "I mean, who are you the next morning if this is gone?" He set down the housing and looked at her. It was a hard question to receive, because it was asked without an agenda. She wasn't using it to steer him toward a decision that benefited her. She was asking because she actually wanted to know the answer, and because she had been watching him long enough to understand that the answer mattered more than any contract term. "I don't know," he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said in 4 days. Evelyn nodded. "I think you do know," she said. "I think that's what's making this hard. Not the money. Not Gordon's offer. You know exactly who you are when you're here. And you've been told for so long that who you are here isn't enough, that you're not sure whether to trust it." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the components across the shed, the pieces he'd pulled back from the melt pile, because something in him refused to accept that they were finished, lined up on the rack, where everything got a second assessment before a final decision was made. He had built an entire operational system around the refusal to accept that assessment too quickly. He had never once applied the same principle to himself. "Vanessa came back," he said. "I know," Evelyn said. She didn't elaborate on how she knew, and he didn't ask. "She wasn't wrong about everything," Caleb said. "When she left, some of what she said was true. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know how to build something bigger than this yard. I was running in place and telling myself it was enough." "And now?" Evelyn asked. "Now I have a plan," he said. "I just have to decide if I trust it." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "You're not asking me about the plan," she said. "You're asking about yourself." He didn't answer that directly because she was right, and they both knew it. What he said instead was, "I heard something. When Vanessa left the other day, she was on the phone near the gate. She didn't know I could still hear her." He told Evelyn what he'd heard, that if he'd had money from the start, she never would have left. He said it without particular bitterness, just as a fact he was still working out how to carry. Evelyn listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "Does it change what you want?" "No," Caleb said. "It just explains something I've been trying not to understand." He told Gordon no the next morning. A brief call professionally handled on both sides, Gordon expressing that the door remained open if circumstances changed. Caleb thanking him and meaning none of that. and knowing Gordon didn't either. He hung up and stood in the foreman's office for a moment, looking at the desk where the ring had sat for 2 weeks before he'd put it in a drawer, and where the acquisition documents now sat in a stack he would need to file or discard. He picked up the stack, set it in the recycling bin, and went back out to the yard. He called Evelyn next. He told her he wanted to move forward not with the trial partnership as currently structured, but with something more substantial. He had been thinking in the 4 days he'd been working alone about what a real expansion would need to look like to preserve what the system actually was, rather than a corporate version of it. He had written some of it down longhand in the notebook he kept on the workbench. He told her he wanted to build the next site himself, the one up the coast she had mentioned, the salvage operation, running without a system. Not oversee it from a distance, not hand documentation to a team, and let them interpret it, but go there. Work, it established the default assumption in practice before anyone tried to turn it into a policy document. Evelyn said, "That's going to take longer." "I know," Caleb said. "The board is going to push back on the timeline," she said. "I know that too," he said. "But you've been pushing back on the board since the beginning. I don't think one more thing is going to break you." There was a brief silence on the line, and then Evelyn said something he hadn't expected, which was that she had been waiting for him to say exactly that. She said it without sentiment, just as a statement of fact, the way she said most things. He wasn't entirely sure what to do with it, but he held on to it. The work that followed was different from the trial partnership in almost every dimension. Evelyn restructured the agreement to give Caleb an equity stake in the expansion rather than a contractor's role, which meant he had lawyers. Now a development that still felt faintly surreal, spent 3 weeks negotiating terms that he read carefully and asked questions about until he understood them completely. The board approved the new structure by a margin of 4-1, which was better than Caleb had expected. Bradford, the consultant from Boston, who had written the artisanal assessment, submitted a revised analysis that Caleb found considerably more accurate than the first one, and he said so to Evelyn, who found this funnier than he'd anticipated. The first expansion site was the industrial corridor 40 miles up the coast that Evelyn had mentioned weeks earlier, a district that had followed the same trajectory as Caleb's town, the same closed facilities and stripped economic base, the same sense of something that used to function having quietly stopped. The existing salvage operation there was run by a man named Russell, who had been managing it without a real system for 11 years, and knew it. Caleb spent the first 6 weeks at the site, working alongside Russell, rather than directing him, learning the specific character of the intake flow and the local supply chain before he introduced any changes to the routing method. Russell was skeptical at first, then curious, then actively engaged the same arc Caleb noted privately that he himself had followed with Evelyn. By the end of the first year, the expansion site was operating at 68% of Hayes Salvage's efficiency rating, which was not a full replication. Caleb had said from the beginning that full replication wasn't the point, but it was more than double what the site had been producing before, and it was built on the same default assumption, recovery over extraction. Every component gets a chance before it gets treated as raw material. There were 2 more sites in development by the time the original Hayes salvage yard completed its renovation. Carter Dynamics had funded the conversion of the old facility into a full recovery center, updated infrastructure, proper testing equipment, expanded capacity. But Caleb had set one condition that he held throughout the entire process: the layout stayed. The organization of the rows, the flow from intake to assessment to routing, the physical logic of the space he had built that stayed intact. The new equipment was installed around it rather than replacing it. The result was something that looked to people who came to see it like an industrial facility that had grown organically from the inside out, which was exactly what it was. On the day the renovation was complete, Caleb walked the yard alone before anyone else arrived. He walked the rows slowly, the way he had every morning for nearly a decade, checking the state of things, paying the kind of attention that had always been his primary method. The equipment was newer, the infrastructure was cleaner, the capacity was larger. But the logic was the same default, the same refusal, the same core assumption running through every part of the system. He stood at the back of the yard near the components rack that had always served as his final check before a decision was made, and he stood there for a while, with his hands in his pockets and the smell of metal and coastal air around him. And he felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a very long time. He was still standing there when he heard footsteps on the gravel, and Evelyn came to stand beside him. She looked at the rack, then at the yard, then at him. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Like it's still mine," Caleb said. Evelyn nodded. That was the right answer, and they both knew it. Then, a year after the renovation, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, when Caleb was in the yard wearing the same work jacket he'd had for 6 years because it still functioned perfectly well, and there was no reason to replace something that still worked, Vanessa came back one more time. She was driving herself a practical detail that registered. She parked outside the gate and stood next to her car for a moment, before walking to the entrance, and she stood there rather than coming in. Caleb saw her from across the yard and walked over without urgency. She looked at the facility, the expanded infrastructure, the signage with the Carter Dynamics partnership branding the new intake bays, already processing the morning's first deliveries. She looked at all of it, and then she looked at Caleb, and her expression had something in it he hadn't seen from her before, which was that she had run out of the particular confidence that had always organized her face. "I've thought a lot about what I said," Vanessa said. "The things I said when I left, the things I said after." Caleb waited. "I think I told myself a story about you," she said. "About what you were and what you were ever going to be. And I was wrong. I know that now." She looked at him with the directness that had always been genuine in her. "I just wanted you to know that I know that." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. There was no anger in him, not because he'd suppressed it, but because somewhere in the past year it had genuinely dissolved, replaced by something quieter and more final. He thought about what she had said near the gate that day, the words that had carried across the distance without her knowing, and he thought about the ring on the concrete and the laughter from the workers and all the ways he had carried the weight of other people's assessments of him for longer than any of it had deserved. "When you left," Caleb said, "you thought this place made me worth less. I spent a long time thinking you might be right, that if someone who knew me decided I wasn't enough, maybe the problem was me." He looked at the yard around him, the rows, the system, the facility that had grown from a decade of quiet refusal to accept that broken things had no value. "But this place didn't make me worth less. It's where I figured out what I was worth. I just didn't know how to see it yet." Vanessa didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say to that, and she seemed to understand it. "I don't think you're a bad person," Caleb said. "I think you wanted things, and you were honest about it, and I respect that. But what you wanted and what I was were always going to be different things. That was true before the video, before any of this." He met her eyes without hostility. "I think we both already knew that." Vanessa nodded once slowly. She looked at the yard for another moment, then back at him. "You look like yourself," she said, which was a strange thing to say. And also he thought exactly right. "Yeah," Caleb said. "I do." She got back in her car and drove away, and Caleb stood at the gate and watched until the car was gone. Then he turned back toward the yard where the morning intake was underway, and Russell was on the phone about the second expansion site, and somewhere in the facility, Evelyn was in the foreman's office running the kind of numbers that had once seemed entirely foreign to a man who sorted copper wire by hand. He walked back through the gate past the rows he had built and rebuilt and built again, and he picked up the work where he had left it. The yard smelled the way it always had. He had never stopped noticing. He had just finally understood that there was nothing about it he needed to apologize for.